It's my pleasure to be here, and I will get right into it with a little introduction to our organization, the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. We are a nonprofit organization that protects wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitat. We are named after this beautiful little blue butterfly. It was named the Xerces blue, named after the king of Persia, who almost conquered the Greek Empire way back in the day. Well, this butterfly used to live in California, but it went extinct about 60 years ago. The first butterfly to go extinct in the US. So the Xerces Society was formed to help prevent that from happening again. Our organization has multiple programs for on-the-ground conservation, the largest being the Pollinator program, but also programs for retaining agricultural biodiversity, conservation of endangered species, which was our founding program, aquatic invertebrates, we have a pesticide program that looks into making sure that pesticides don't become a problem for invertebrates, and an urban conservation program, among others. This map is showing you office locations of pollinator team staff. We're spread out across much of the country. And our work, of course, is totally dependent on donors and grants also, but donors make it possible. We are a donor-supported nonprofit. So if you're not a member, please consider becoming a member to help us do our work and help us expand to some parts of the country where we don't have locations yet. We would very much appreciate it because we like working hard to conserve invertebrates. By the way, all of us presenters today are also partner biologists with the USDA NRCS. And the mission of the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, is to deliver conservation solutions so that agricultural producers can protect natural resources and feed a growing world. And we on this call do that by providing technical assistance to farmers and ranchers. So where's this talk headed? I'm going to give a brief intro on the status of pollinators and monarchs, talk a little bit about monarchs and rangeland. Ray Powers will talk about Pollinator Basics and Bmps for Great Plains rangelands. Dee Soto will talk about Bmps for Western rangelands. And then all of us, plus our good friend Sarah Hamilton Buxton, will answer questions. So you may have heard there's a lot of bad news about the status of invertebrates, the diversity, abundance, and biomass of insects and other invertebrates. These things are decreasing in most places where they've been studied. For instance, in North America, about 28% of our bumblebee species are considered threatened. That's shown in the upper right portion of this pie graph. Butterflies are undergoing decline. In California, a study that has gone on for 45 years showed that butterfly abundance is declining at all sites and in all major groups of butterflies. Here in the middle, point out that a similar study in Ohio over 21 years showed a major decrease in butterflies. And then as far as a single species, one we work on most is the monarch, shown here on the right. You may have heard they've undergone major declines in the last 30 years. Speaking of the monarch use of rangeland is underappreciated. Here's a photo of some rangeland. It happens to have a bison in the middle, but there are also cattle there. Monarchs use this site and many other rangelands in the breeding season and during fall migration. It's important to know that most butterfly caterpillars, including monarchs, are host plant specialists. In the case of monarchs, their caterpillars only use milkweeds. So back to the same photo, this rangeland with the bison, all those plants there that look like sort of greenish yellow pom-poms, those are milkweeds. And this preserve, where I do some work each summer, has hundreds of thousands, if not millions of milkweed plants. And the NRCS has been collecting data on rangelands throughout the western half of the country in a system called the NRI. And that data set indicates that there are billions of milkweed plants out there on our rangelands. Are milkweeds compatible with grazing? A lot of people think not, but we think they can be compatible with grazing. Cardetalides are chemicals within milkweeds that make them toxic to vertebrates. But scientists at the USDA Toxic Plant Research Center have informed us that they almost never receive reports of livestock losses due to milkweeds. Why is this? Well, it's important to know that cardenolide concentrations vary greatly by species. It's important to know that cardenolides taste bitter to vertebrates. Therefore, cattle and some other livestock usually refrain from eating milkweeds that have high concentrations of these cardenolides because they taste bad, they taste bitter. Therefore, if we look at a list of milkweeds that could be found at rangelands scattered around the country and order the list by species at the top that have very high cardenolide concentrations, like Asclepias asperula, versus those below, you'll note that there's an enormous range. That species at the top is extremely toxic. The species down at the bottom has almost no toxin whatsoever. And that line that I put in there is sort of a cutoff. The species above that line, in our experience, anecdotally, almost never get eaten by livestock. The species below the line, we're getting more and more data that the low cardenolide species do get eaten by livestock. In some cases, to such a great extent that the milkweeds, those milkweeds may need to be protected from livestock. As opposed to ranchers being worried about the livestock being hurt by the milkweeds may be hurt by livestock. We need more research on this, but here's an example of a great study that was conducted recently in Nebraska by Timothy Dixon, Chris Helzer, and Brittany Pointer. They compared grazed rangeland to ungrazed range in Nebraska, and they tracked the grasses and the milkweeds. And the milkweed there, common milkweed, Asclepias syriaca, which happens to have low concentrations of cardenolides, they found that cattle ate loads of them with no adverse effects to the cattle. So we ask you, on rangelands, please don't spray milkweeds. They're real important for monarchs. They tend to have flowers, wonderful for pollinators in general. And thus far, we're getting more and more information indicating that they are compatible with livestock.
So I'm going to go over some pollinator basics pretty briefly and talk a little bit about the life cycle of some of these pollinators, so we can understand where they might be on our rangeland and how our management might be affecting some of these creatures. So this is my standard Meet the Pollinator slide with 6 broad groups of insects that do pollination. So we've got the bees in the upper left, wasps in the upper center. So bees, wasps, now that you finally see them up on the upper left. Then we have flies, beetles, butterflies, and moths. Are the main groups of insect pollinators that we think about on rangeland and in all of our work. And I'd like to stress that these are an incredibly diverse groups of insects. Even sometimes single groups are containing thousands to tens of thousands of species. So just a kind of astonishing number of species that can be found kind of across the country and working to pollinate these wild plant species. Especially flies, I think, are really underappreciated as pollinators. And also we just really don't have a good handle on the diversity of flies. Let's see if, there we go. All right. I rarely, if ever, get to talk about vertebrate pollinators because of the region of the country that I'm in. But because PD later will be talking about a region of the country that includes the Southwest, I got to put this adorable bat species here, the lesser long-nosed bat. We just have a handful of bat species that do some pollination in the United States. So there's your adorable bat covered in pollen for the day. All right, so when we think about the components of pollinator habitat, I mean, they're pretty basic. We're talking about food, shelter, connectivity, and protection from pesticides. I'm going to talk more about those first two components, food and shelter, in the next section. And then when we start talking about the best management practices on rangeland, we'll talk a little bit more about pesticides. So food, what is food for pollinators? Well, hopefully you've all gotten the message that flowers, flowers are what our pollinators need. They need that pollen and nectar both to provision their nests and also to fuel adult activity. That group of bees as pollinators, they are using pollen and nectar throughout all of their life stages to provision their young and also for the adults. All those other groups of invertebrate pollinators are eating nectar and pollen as adults, and their young is usually eating something else, including things like plant material and other insects. So we want to think about having flowers throughout the entire growing season. We think about how diverse the number of species and groups of insects that are doing this pollination. There's going to be some pollinator out there looking for food during any part of your growing season, and that probably varies regionally. So for me here in Nebraska, I think about March 15th to October 15th, and I think I want to have a flower, at least one flower species, and hopefully many more flower species available throughout that entire period. We also want to think about host plants for things like moth and butterfly caterpillars, so that's what those young are eating. And some of those other groups are predatory in their young life stages, so making sure we're supporting diverse insect communities. The other thing we want to think about is the soil. A lot of these pollinator groups in their larval stages are in or on the soil, so trying not to disturb that area too much either, and that kind of provides for that whole diverse group of pollinators. I'm going to go through a solitary bee life cycle because I get a lot of questions about this. So when we're seeing bees out and about, that's their adult life stage, and for most bees that's a pretty short span of their life. 3 to 4 to 6 weeks for our solitary bees is when they're out and needing flowers. And the female during that time is collecting nectar and pollen, and she's actually burrowing these nests and making this ball of pollen and nectar, which is what you see at the bottom of that little nest in the second picture. And then she'll lay an egg on that pollen and nectar ball. That larva will hatch and consume the pollen and nectar, and then it will pupate to eventually emerge again as an adult when the timing is right. So the whole rest of the year is really in that bottom half of the photos. So providing those nesting and overwintering sites and protecting them is really important. Our native bees have a variety of nesting habitats. The vast majority of them are like the Andrena species I showed above. About 70 to 80% are ground nesting bees, and they will nest in a variety of substrates of soil, different soil texture, different soil moisture. The other 20 to 30% are stem nesting or tunnel nesting species. You can see that hole in the stem in the photo where that pithy stem has actually been excavated, and the female bee will enter and lay her eggs on the pollen ball inside the stem and use various materials to kind of partition that stem throughout. And finally, we have our Bumble Bees, which are just 1% of our native bee species. They're a little bit more social bee species, so they will make colonies, usually in kind of messy places within the litter on the ground, sometimes a little bit underground nest, like an abandoned rodent burrow. They'll nest in rock piles and kind of forgotten places for the bumblebees. And sort of this array of underground, in our stems, and at the ground layer also encompasses a lot of the places that we find those other insects groups nesting and overwintering. So when we're thinking about protecting those sites, rangelands have, awesome above ground stems for most species. And there you can see one of our stem nesting species. It looks like she's partitioned that with some of the pith from the stem. So making sure we're not disturbing all of that above ground vegetation. Some bees do require more access to bare ground, so and they'll use anything, between bunch grasses, really small areas of bare ground. They'll be near water sources, and just in a wide variety of places on the ranch. And finally, I like to highlight kind of those messy or maybe forgotten places like riparian areas or windbreaks, leaving those logs down and providing for those species that might be found in those areas, because they certainly support a whole lot of our pollinating species. So I hope you've gathered from the last few slides that rangeland really has all the components of pollinator habitat that we need. And it's really undervalued, I think, for the resources that it provides for our pollinators. This map is showing rangeland prior to Euro-American settlement. So in the photo here, the beige or tan color is all of the open grassland or rangeland that was present before Euro-American settlement. And we know that many pollinators evolved on these rangelands. And to this day, we have pollinators that are sort of rangeland endemic. They rely on maybe a single species of plant that's only found on our rangelands. Additionally, we have a lot of species that are threatened or endangered that are on these spaces that have evolved with these grasslands. So here's a map from 2007 showing our extant rangeland. The brown in this photo is private rangeland. The tannish green color is public rangeland. So I'll point out later, there's a lot more public range in the West compared to the mostly private rangelands here in the Great Plains. And I think you can see the component of connectivity here really well and see how we have the potential to have really well-connected, well-managed habitat for pollinators and a ton of other wildlife species. So a lot of the guidance that I'm going to get into now, it's coming from a document that we worked really hard on, Rangeland Management and Pollinators. This is a guide for producers in the Great Plains. This was work done with my colleagues, wonderful colleagues, Sarah Hamilton-Buxton, who's on the call, Jenny Hopwood in Omaha, and Ray Morans, who spoke earlier. We spent a long time wrestling with this, and it's meant to be a really easy document to pick up and read. It's just 6 pages and has some pretty broad best management strategies for rangelands. I do want to preface this next section with some of the struggles that we had in creating this document. The Great Plains is a huge area with a lot of variability in plant composition and moisture regimes. It just has a lot of variety across the large area. And there are quite a lot of research gaps, ongoing research gaps with how our management impacts pollinators. This is an area of ongoing research, and there's some really great university labs across this region that are doing work in these areas, but the amount of published literature, especially that's relevant for this region, is pretty small. So a lot of what we relied on was outside of the Great Plains. They're going to seem very broad, and they are very broad recommendations kind of for both of those reasons. Huge area with a lot of diversity. It gets really hard to give kind of site-specific information when you're talking about over such a large area. And when we talked about the grazing regimes that we were all familiar with across this Great Plains area, we really felt that there's a lot of right ways to manage for pollinator habitat. So there's a lot of different ways you can manage your range that provides good pollinator habitat. So how is the Great Plains different from the West? Which Dee Dee will be talking more about Western rangelands shortly. It's certainly a more productive area than the West, receives more precipitation, and we've got more green growth, particularly in the eastern part, where we've got the tall grass prairies that are just amazingly productive. Less topographic diversity. I had flatter here for a while. It just tends to have, less elevation. So we've got less sort of altitude differences and less variety in our plant communities because of that. We know this area had very large herds of bison for a really long time, so it evolved with grazers, and in some cases, intense grazing pressure. Again, we've got a lot of private rangeland and very, very little public rangeland. Although it's not true of the entire region, parts of the Great Plains definitely have a more prescribed fire culture than the Western rangelands. So they're a little bit more open to fire, although parts of the Great Plains are still pretty reticent to use fire on the ranch. Okay, so I'm going to go through the risks and benefits of each of these management strategies for pollinators, and also our best management recommendations for these management activities. I'm going to veer a little bit off that track when I talk about pesticides and just talk about some of the pesticide actions that might be happening on rangelands. So we'll dive right in with grazing, which is definitely our primary use across most of these grasslands. We know that when we're overgrazing, that can really impact the plant community composition. It decreases the wildflower diversity on a site. And if you're overgrazing the same site through time, we know that some of those highly palatable wildflowers will disappear from the site. If you're grazing really intensely, even those less palatable species will not be present all the time. When we're grazing at such an intensity as you see the photo on the right, you can see there's not a lot of stem nesting sites available for our bees, and also those food resources for caterpillars are not nearly as available as in a less grazed area. Also, the impacts of soil compaction from overgrazing, they're not super clear yet or super well studied, but likely is harming those ground nesting sites as well as those soil dwelling life stages. Those are some of the risks of overgrazing. But well-managed grazing can be a really awesome tool. It can promote native wildflower diversity and kind of help keep that grass dominance down on some of our rangeland sites. It can also help maintain healthy grass through time. And it really provides this heterogeneous habitat, which is great for grassland nesting birds and also pollinators when you've got that diversity of sites. So our best management practices for grazing and pollinators, manages for proper utilization levels. I think we want to be really upfront in saying that, you know, if cattle weren't on these sites, they probably wouldn't exist anymore. So we want to make sure that we're balancing that livestock performance and rangeland health with the abundance and diversity of wildflowers. Allows for proper plant recovery times. I think we're thinking specifically of wildflowers in this bullet point. We want those wildflowers to have enough of a rest from grazing that they're able to bloom and reproduce. Changing the season of use. So when cattle are out in those pastures, it's kind of changing from year to year for each individual pasture. We want you to be monitoring the effects of grazing practices on wildflowers. I think a lot of ranchers monitor their grass very closely and very well, but including wildflowers into that monitoring could help you adjust your practices to achieve multiple goals. So both keep your grass healthy and your wildflowers present. One system that has worked really well in regions of the Great Plains is to integrate fire with your grazing regime. And there's a number of ways that can be done. So we'll launch right into the fire section. So these risks, benefits, and BMPs are applicable both if you're integrating with grazing or if you're managing with fire alone, which does happen sometimes in the East, especially on conservation lands in the tall grass prairie. So here in Nebraska, a lot of our fire regime really is aimed at killing invasive trees across much of the central Great Plains. The eastern red cedar has really become a pernicious, nasty, expensive problem. And prescribed fire is a really efficient and effective means of controlling that species and maintaining our grass cover on rangelands. By removing that litter, it can increase bare ground for ground nesting bees. And we know that for some species of rangeland wildflowers, following a burn, they actually produce more flowers and more stems for flowers. And the species that we do know are really high quality pollinator plants. That's a great benefit. Fire will kill pollinators in multiple life stages. So most of our ground nesting bees are nesting deep enough that it appears they're not being affected by fire, but some of those shallow nesting species will perish, as well as things like Bumble Bees that are nesting more at the surface. It's eliminating stem nesting sites for multiple years for a lot of species. And when we burn our sites, there's that immediate loss of pollen and nectar resources if it's during a time when the wildflowers are blooming. So our BMPs for prescribed fire, ideally burn no more than 1/3 of the area each year. This allows for refuge sites for a wide variety of pollinators, and then they can quickly recolonize the burn area. In large landscapes, limit burn patch size, more smaller burns as opposed to very large burns. Unburned patches, even relatively small unburned patches within a burn area are beneficial. So rotating that season of burn can help. So if you do a burn, in the growing season, you might have a slower, patchier burn, and that can leave those refuge spots and also kind of changes the impact of how that fire affects our plant communities. And that final piece of burn whenever you can be tough to have the stars aligned, to have the right weather conditions and a team ready to go. Being ready to jump on it when you can is great. I'm hearing a lot more about growing season and winter burns here in Nebraska. And I think that's really exciting. And I'm excited to see what impacts kind of change, especially with a growing season burn. All right, I will talk briefly about haying. I think this is a less used strategy, but it is used in some areas, especially to provision livestock for the winter. A lot of the risks and benefits are the same as prescribed fire. You're removing wildflowers, you're removing stem nesting sites, and you can kill multiple stages of pollinators. But it does remove that excess litter, and that can help young wildflowers get more sunlight, and it can increase bare ground for ground nesting bees. So again, pretty similar to the burning. Ideally, we would limit haying to 1/3 or less of a property. In the eastern tall grass, maintaining cutting heights of 8 inches or higher is a lot more reasonable than it is in the western portions of the Great Plains. Cutting hay only once per season and rotating that seasonal time of hay again. So we're kind of moving those risks across the landscape. Okay, let's talk about pesticides on rangelands. What's missing from this bucolic scene? Well, we don't see lovely patches of color, clearly. Our wildflowers are missing from this scene. This is most prevalent in the southern plains, where broadcast sprays of selective herbicides to take out those broad-leafed wildflowers or weeds does happen on large swaths of rangeland. However, recent research is showing that it really has no effect on livestock gain, even if there are some slight increases in grass production. So really the bottom line is that ranchers are paying for a treatment application that's not helping them. It doesn't have any measurable benefit to their livestock, and they're losing really valuable wildlife habitat. So please don't spray your native forbs, whether those are broadcast sprays or targeted sprays. Livestock eat many forbs and they are nutritious, and we do have some documents in the works to help convey some of that value of our wildflowers to both livestock and pollinators. So keep an eye out for some documents to come. Finally, avoiding those broadcast applications and just using targeted herbicide applications for invasive and or noxious weeds. And as we always recommend, follow label directions for those herbicide applications. Another risk for pollinators on rangeland is the use of insecticides, specifically for grasshopper and Mormon cricket control. So APHIS annually applies airily a lot of insecticides to try to control grasshopper and Mormon cricket outbreaks. However, many of these species are not pests, they're native species. They play a critical role in the food web, and a lot of other species are really dependent on them. And the sprays do impact a whole lot of other invertebrate species. So what we would recommend there is to practice preventative management if you're in an area with a potential grasshopper outbreak. Regionally specific fire and grazing plans are effective. And rangelands can often support a really vast number of these grasshopper species with no economic impact. If you do feel that you've reached an economic impact, if you can use the lowest effective application rate and just treat areas of concern instead of spraying large swaths of the ranch. And finally, making sure we're just protecting those water sources and other sensitive habitat areas when we're talking about grasshoppers. I know when I talk with rangeland managers here in Nebraska, this doesn't seem to be a treatment that pays out for them. A lot of times years where we have a lot of grasshoppers are really droughty years. And so that forage just isn't really worth the payment that they have to make to get these applications on the ground, even with an incentive from APHIS. But I do know in other parts of the Northern Plains, this is a pretty prevalent practice, and it does bleed into the Western rangelands as well. I'm going to mention interseeding. It's not a practice used commonly on rangelands, but it can be a really effective tool to increase diversity on depauperate grasslands. And basically, this is kind of overseeding or adding seed to a rangeland site. And it really is a multi-year process where we're doing vegetation management and suppression before and after interseeding. And when we're working on native rangelands, we do want to be really careful with the seed species that we're selecting and the origin of those species, and looking to more intact rangeland sites to make sure we're putting the right things down. So finally, kind of coming back to this Bmps and feeling like they're very broad and there's a lot of right ways to do it. In our document, we have this checklist at the very end that says, what does pollinator habitat on a ranch look like? And this is a checklist that we hope if you can go to various places on your ranch throughout the season and check these things off, you're providing pollinator habitat. You're seeing blooming flowers throughout the whole growing season. There are multiple species of flowers blooming nearby. You have different heights of vegetation, bare ground, recovering or lightly grazed areas that you can see. In addition to those visual cues, you're managing during different seasons of the year to allow those different plant communities to thrive. And as I've said before, this really helps us move the impact of that management around and allows our wildflowers to bloom and reproduce and allows our pollinators the places they need to thrive. That is what I have, and I am going to stop sharing and pass it over to Dee Dee. Looking good, Dee Dee.
All right, everybody, thanks so much for being here. I'm Dee Dee Soto. I'm a pollinator conservation planner and Nrcs partner biologist with Xerces out of California. And today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about best management practices for pollinators on Western rangelands. Just a couple of things that I'll be covering will be grazing, pesticides, invasive plant species, insecticide use, fire, and manage pollinators on rangelands. So in the West, approximately 50% of all land is rangelands, and approximately 80% of public land is rangeland. So we have a lot of rangeland in the West, and it's essential for the conservation of pollinators. In comparison to the Eastern rangelands and the Great Plains Western rangelands are very diverse in topography. We have a lot of mountain ranges, and this creates different plant communities all over the place. So there's a lot of topography in this. There's a lot of different flora and fauna, and California, for example, is a diversity hotspot and also the state in the lower US that has the highest diversity in plant communities and plant species. And in fact, the arid West is a diversity hotspot for native bee species as well as other pollinators. And Western rangelands are very diverse in scope. We have all sorts of habitat types and ecosystems ranging from temperate rainforest to deserts and everything in between. So as you can see here, the map on the left is indicating diversity of bee species in the West, and where you see areas that are colored red, those are some of the highest diversity areas for bees, and then green being the lowest. So as you can see, the arid West is really just a hotspot for bee diversity. And then on the right-hand side, there's a map for monarch suitability. So the arid West is also really suitable habitat for monarchs as well. Western rangelands are also home to several bumblebee species that are listed as on the IUCN list for being at risk or endangered. And these include Franklin's bumblebee, cuckoo bumblebees, and all of these bumblebees that are listed here. And then a very well-known topic at the moment is Western monarchs, and they're just really in crisis right now. There was approximately 4.5 million monarchs overwintering in California in the 1980s. And since then, we've seen drastic decreases in their populations. The migratory population of Western monarchs just this last year was counted under 2,000 monarchs, and that's less than 1% of what was here in the 1980s. And then it's also really concerning because the projected threshold for quasi-extinction of Western monarchs was calculated to be around 30,000 individuals, and we've definitely gone far below that. So it's a huge concern here in the West, and hopefully some of these BMPs will help you make management decisions that can benefit monarchs. So monarchs are milkweed specialists, meaning that milkweeds are the only plants that they can use as larval hosts. Native milkweeds are broadly distributed across the United States, as far north as southern Canada, and there are approximately 72 milkweed species native to the US and Canada, excluding subspecies, and approximately 44 of those species are found in the Western US. Showy milkweed is the most broadly distributed of the species in the West, and monarchs have been documented using approximately 20 of those species that we do have as larval hosts. And then we also have several non-native milkweed species that occur in California, including tropical milkweed, which is of concern. And as you can see on the map here, the arid Southwest is really a hotspot for diversity of milkweeds, with Arizona and New Mexico having both 29 different species of milkweeds. And then other states like Colorado and California coming in close and having quite a bit of diversity in milkweed species themselves. So many people typically think of monarch habitat as being mesic grasslands, but monarchs have been documented using desert milkweeds as larval hosts, including both species shown here. On the left is desert milkweed, Asclepias erosa, and on the right is pallid milkweed. So, you know, arid rangelands are of use to many different pollinators, and it doesn't just have to be mesic environments in which they find themselves. Milkweed plants also provide habitat for a wide variety of butterflies, moths, and native bees, including western bumblebees, which is a species of conservation concern in the West, and assemblages of other insects, some of which are milkweed specialists, and birds. So as you can see here, milkweed provides food and habitat for a variety of different species, not just monarchs. So they're really important plants to manage on rangelands. And as both Rays mentioned earlier, it really can coexist with livestock and grazing. And as you can see here, it provides nectar and pollen for flies, wasps, butterflies, hummingbirds, nocturnal moths, and all sorts of different bees. Western rangelands also are host to several at-risk pollinators, and this includes 17 butterfly species, which are federally listed. A quarter of mason bee species are also at risk, and we have 2 at-risk bat species in the Southwest. So management practices such as grazing, fire, mowing, pesticide, recreation, grasshopper management, and managed pollinators can all have both positive and negative effects on native pollinators and rangelands. So let's move into BMPs for some of these management actions and talk about this a little bit more. There are 4 overarching principles that should be considered when making management decisions. And we want to manage for heterogeneity. We want to make sure that there's diversity in vegetation, structure, and management practices should help maximize biodiversity. We also want to consider interactions and how natural forces and active management interact. And we want to have adaptive management for diversity. And we want to see, change things as we go, because the same management action all the time isn't going to work all the time. And then there's also a lot of knowledge gaps regarding pollinators on rangelands. So we have a lot of incomplete knowledge, and this would greatly benefit from data and, tinkering. So like playing around with different management actions. And ultimately, sharing that information is super useful to everyone so that we can make better management decisions in the future. Rangeland conservation and restoration efforts often overlap. Pollinators have overlap with other efforts, such as the greater sage grouse conservation efforts that happen in a lot of the West. So how do you go about protecting existing pollinator habitat on rangelands? And one simple way is by adjusting the timing of management or livestock grazing to minimize harm to pollinators and their habitat. And as you can see on the slide, on the list of plant species that are good for native bees, monarchs, and greater sage grouse, there's a lot of overlap with plant species that can be used in restoration efforts that would greatly benefit all three species and a variety of all of the other pollinators on our rangelands. So the Xerces Society partnered with Monarch Joint Venture to develop a management timing fact sheet, which you can see on the left. And this management timing gives guidance on when it's safe to implement things like prescribed fire or mowing to minimize harm to monarch breeding habitat. And in addition, Xerces developed recommended management timing for native bees for the Bmps for pollinators on Western rangelands, which is the graph on the right. And you'll notice that there's a lot of overlap in timing between monarchs and native bees. They're both most active and breeding spring through summer in the West. So these are available in our documents, and you can definitely find them online. But looking to these to make some of those management decisions would be really useful, so that we're not affecting pollinators when they're most active. All right, so let's delve a little bit deeper into some of these best management practices. So we want to manage for habitat heterogeneity. And what does this mean? We want to protect existing native plants and plant a diverse mix of flowering plants. So we want to increase native milkweeds and other nectar plants that are available to pollinators. And we want to protect existing habitat. A lot of this is management decisions for monarch butterflies, so definitely planting native milkweed and nectar species for them, but make sure that these also overlap with a lot of our other pollinators, such as bees and moths and other butterflies. And here in the West, early blooming or early emerging plants are of particular importance, especially with climate change. So using plants that, especially milkweeds that emerge sooner, would be really beneficial for monarchs. And we also want to plant and manage for multiple native plant species. Diversity sort of begets diversity. So if you have a diverse stand of plants, you'll also have a diverse community of pollinators and other animals. So research shows that as grazing intensity increases, pollinator abundance and diversity decreases, and grazing can have both direct and indirect effects on pollinators. For example, livestock can trample immature stages that are immobile or affect habitat that they may change a pollinator's behavior. For example, some butterflies won't lay eggs in areas that have been grazed. And some of the indirect effects include removing pollinator forage and nest habitat, soil compaction, altering hydrology, which can both cause changes in plant community. So some of those direct effects are, it can cause pollinator mortality. And then some of the really big indirect effects is a change in plant community. So grazing can have, can greatly affect a shift in the types of plants that we're seeing. And a lot of that depends on the timing and intensity of grazing. So there's no one size fits all grazing prescription for pollinators and conservation on rangelands, especially on rangelands in the West that are so diverse. And rangelands in the West occur in a wide variety of habitats, so it depends on the habitat type being grazed, the baseline conditions, the presence of invasive plant species, and adaptive management is key to ensure livestock grazing isn't degrading habitat for pollinators, plants, and other wildlife. However, there are some broad overarching practices that research supports as being positive for pollinators. And some of these include broad recommendations like for grazing timing, intensity, duration, and location. So here in the West, we recommend fall and winter grazing, and this is the time where pollinators are least effective, but we know that grazing happens throughout the year, especially where conditions are good throughout the entire year for cattle to graze. But there can be a downside, and as Ray mentioned earlier, this overgrazing can definitely change plant communities and can reduce pollinator diversity. So we also recommend that 40% be the max utilization rate and that you use rotational grazing or high intensity and short duration and graze a low amount of AUMs. And also limit access to riparian areas and sensitive pollinator and butterfly host plant areas. So livestock tend to congregate in mesic habitats, which mesic habitats are like wetlands or riparian areas. And they can cause damage to the plant communities and soils as shown in this photo. In the photo on the right, you can see a healthy riparian area. And then on the left, you can see a stream bank with erosion and invasive species caused by heavy use. Mesic habitats in Western rangelands comprise a small fraction of the landscape. In the Great Basin, they're approximately 1%, and yet they often support a high diversity of butterflies, including many endemic species and monarch butterflies, and may support a higher abundance of pollinators compared to more xeric habitats. So it's really important to really care for our riparian areas. Oftentimes, these can serve as oases for a lot of different animals, not just pollinators. So the better work that we do in protecting them, the more that we can have a diverse landscape and ecosystem around these mesic habitats. And heavy use, like the picture on the left, can also cause sedimentation and really change hydrology too. So it's something to be really aware of. And an option for caring for our wetland areas could be to protect them by fencing them, but also making a big enough area so that you can periodically graze these areas so they don't get overgrown and thatchy as well. So is milkweed compatible with grazing? And we heard from Ray earlier, it is. As we all know, monarch butterflies require milkweed to reproduce. And the milkweed plants contain toxic compounds that the butterfly uses as a predator defense. So they eat the milkweed and become toxic themselves, and this is just a defense mechanism for them. But it's important to have these plants out there so that we can provide habitat for our monarchs. And milkweeds and cattle can definitely coexist together. So milkweed toxicity varies, and some milkweed species in the West contain low levels of toxic compounds. So livestock may consume them without consequence. More research is needed to confirm this, but as Ray mentioned earlier too, oftentimes you see a lot of cattle munching on some of these milkweeds and they seem completely fine and unaffected. And oftentimes you have to protect the milkweed from the livestock instead of the other way around. And I've personally have seen many rangeland areas where milkweeds and livestock coexist without any economic effect on your grazing operations. Like it's totally doable, and they can live side by side. So another thing I wanted to mention is invasive or non-native plant control. Please don't spray your native forbs, and plant identification is really important for this. I know I've seen a lot of times where if it's a thistle, you spray it, even if it's a native thistle, and that really shouldn't be practiced. A lot of native thistles are really good plants for pollinators. Bees really love thistles, so it's knowing your plants is pretty key. And make sure to not spray something that is native because it provides good habitat for pollinators. Oftentimes livestock eat many forbs. They can also be nutritious. Livestock don't just eat only grass. And then we should avoid broadcast applications and use targeted applications. I know that in some Western rangelands, a lot of times folks don't like sagebrush, and there have been broad herbicide applications to sagebrush. But as Ray Powers mentioned earlier, these kinds of broadcast applications don't really have a huge impact on any gains or weight gains for cattle or economic gains for an operation. And then they just result in lower diversity for your plant communities and also animal communities as well. And definitely you want to follow the label directions. Make sure you read and understand them really well and use the proper dosages. And oftentimes, many native pollinators use invasive species for nectar and pollen. So make sure you don't apply herbicides while pollinators are actively foraging on these plants. And if they make up a really large portion of your land, you might want to manage them so that you only affect a third of the size of your land instead of doing it all in one swoop, because you can greatly reduce forage for pollinators. I mean, the goal is to get rid of them, but sometimes you might want to do it in smaller chunks than all in one go. And then I also wanted to talk about insecticides. Pesticides are a major threat to pollinators in Western rangelands. And Ray Powers talked about this briefly earlier. APHIS does have an annual application of insecticides, which they apply aerially on Western rangelands. And there's about 17 states in which it's applied. And the problem with this is that the insecticide that's used reduces the ability of an insect to produce chitin. And when broad applications are done in this way, it doesn't just affect your target species, it affects other species as well. And a lot of times this can, affect our pollinators, and we definitely don't want that. Also, there are more than 400 species of grasshoppers in Western North America, but only about a dozen of those grasshoppers actually develop into high densities on rangelands and cause some sort of economic impact. If you're a rancher or grow crops in grasshopper-prone areas of the West, you want to implement methods to reduce the susceptibility of your land to grasshopper outbreaks. So you want to monitor for nymphs during spring and early summer. If grasshopper counts indicate potential for significant economic harm, you want to weigh all of your options before deciding to use insecticides. And if you do have to use insecticides, you want to survey for butterflies and other pollinators and avoid any application to host plants. And make sure to time the pesticide application to avoid exposure to at-risk species. And don't apply pesticides, especially insecticides, when monarchs, adults, and immature are present or expected to be present, and avoid aerial applications. You also want to include some buffers around all your water sources, your streams and wetlands and rivers, as well as any threatened or endangered species habitat. And this includes plant species that are threatened or endangered. So we'll talk about fire a little bit in pollinators, and fire is definitely a hot topic here in the Western US, especially with the fire year that we had last year. But fire is an important management tool to maintain open plant communities such as grasslands by suppressing woody vegetation encroachment and maintaining early seral state native plant communities with abundant butterfly nectar and larval host plants. Fire can increase habitat quality, which is often beneficial for many pollinators in the long term, even if in the short term it causes direct mortality. And although fire can cause direct mortality in the short term, there are many benefits to burning. Fire can help reduce invasive plant species and create more diverse plant communities. Prescribed fire can help reduce fuels and potentially lessen the effect of wildfires. Fire can also help reduce plant pest pressure, disease, and parasites, and therefore improve plant health. And it can also create bare ground for ground nesting bees, snags, and deadwood for stem and cavity nesting pollinators too. And there's some anecdotal evidence that summer fire encourages growth of clonal milkweed species like showy and narrowleaf milkweed. And here in the West, it's not feasible to conduct controlled burns in the summer, or so burn when you can and when the conditions are right. But typically here in the West, we would do fall and winter burns. And then some of the other BMPs would be to leave at least 1/3 of an area unburned, especially important if you're burning in the summer. And a lot of this has to do, where you can burn depends on the type of precipitation, and drought conditions play a huge role in the West too. And then moisture levels and wind and all those other factors that play into burns. Ideally burn during the dormant season, so October to February here in the West. Plan burns to increase habitat heterogeneity. So as I mentioned before, prescribed fire and burns can definitely change your plant community and can increase heterogeneity. And if you do any seeding or restoration planting after, you want to make sure that you include attractive pollinator plants in post-fire seeding or planting. So definitely include a lot of nectar species and milkweeds for monarchs and other pollinators. And then there's some limited research that suggests that shade is important for monarch breeding during the hot summer months in the West. So when burning, you want to make sure that you leave some trees, so that they could provide that necessary cover for monarchs. Another topic I wanted to mention is managed pollinators. So honeybees, and then there's also bumblebees that are managed and some orchard bees. But beekeeping does not mean, is not equivalent to bee conservation. And there's a lot of good reasons for keeping honeybees, but conservation isn't really one of them. So managed pollinators have been introduced to rangelands, both in public and private lands in the West. And when they're not providing pollination services, they need a place to forage. And introducing managed pollinators in rangeland settings can be problematic because oftentimes managed pollinators such as honeybees and bumblebees can be vectors for disease and parasites to native pollinators. So be cognizant of where you're introducing managed pollinators to, and be aware that they can introduce diseases and parasites into our native bee populations. And then finally, I wanted to mention monitoring, and you have to adapt with what you're seeing out on the landscape. So all the land managers and ranchers and landowners that are doing any kind of range management, definitely you need to monitor your range and adapt as necessary. And some factors to consider when adjusting management is to protect pollinator habitat would be native grazers or overlap of dietary preferences with pollinators, drought sensitive habitats such as springs, montane meadows, and riparian areas, fire and overutilization. And so some takeaway messages: rangelands are important habitat for monarchs and other pollinators. Xerces Society has developed Bmps for ranchers and rangelands managers. And we need more research to better hone these Bmps and to have more information to make better management decisions over time. So some additional resources, and these are the documents which we used in making this presentation. Ray Powers had mentioned Rangeland Management and Pollinators, a guide for producers in the Great Plains. And then I was looking into best management practices for pollinators on Western rangelands, and they're all available to you on our website. And there are way too many topics to cover in an hour-long webinar regarding how to best manage rangelands for pollinators. So hopefully this information was useful, and I encourage you to download and look through the BMP documents, which we discussed. And there's a lot of things that we weren't able to cover that are in the documents. So whenever you get a chance, definitely look at those. Another document that Xerces developed is Managing for Monarchs in the West. And this is also available on our website for you to download. And we also have regional monarch nectar plant guides, as well as other pollinator plant sheets, which you can find on our website as well. And we have tons of fact sheets and brochures and guidelines and reports that are all available to you as well in our publications library. We have a YouTube Xerces channel, which this presentation will go on after it's edited, and you'll see it shortly, hopefully, on our YouTube channel. But there are so many different really good presentations and webinars on there, and just a plethora of information and resources. Also connect with Xerces Society through various other social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So if you're interested in that, definitely follow us. And I also wanted to mention some upcoming webinars. On April 1st, we'll have Soil Invertebrates, Getting to Know the Life in Soil. April 8th, Getting to Know the Good Bugs, Scouting for Pollinators and Other Beneficial Insects. April 22nd, Insect Apocalypse with Scott Black. And May 6th, Supporting Pollinators Over Time, How to Maintain Wildflower Diversity. We would also like to thank all of our supporters and donors who make this all possible. Without all of you, we wouldn't be able to do all the great work that we do or put on webinars such as this. So thank you all very much. And we would also like to thank all of the participants for tuning in and joining us today. And with that, we'll move on to questions, and I'll leave this up so that you can get our contact information if you need it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dee, and thank you to all the presenters. So we do have a few questions in both the Q&A and the chat. If you do have questions, I do ask that you use the Q&A so then everybody can see those, but we'll go through kind of both of them. So the first question, Ray Moran's, this one's for you. Does burning of rangelands kill or harm the common milkweed?
Thank you very much for that question. I was going to give you the very general answer that in my experience, fire tends to be beneficial for most of the milkweed species that I've encountered. But then I remembered a paper by Ricono et al. Ricono, R-I-C-O-N-O, published in 2018. And in that paper by Ricono, she made it very clear that fire increased the abundance of common milkweed, Asclepias syriaca. So in my experience with other species, anecdotally and with data, I have an unpublished data set on butterfly milkweed showing fire increases the abundance of that species. So it tends to be a positive for our native milkweeds.
Thank you, Ray. And the next question was also for you, and I believe that you put some of this information in the chat, but they were asking for the citations for the work about the compatibility of grazing and milkweeds, utilization of milkweed by cattle with no adverse health effects.
And that question was from Ariel, and it's a wonderful question. And I need to be upfront and say there may be no published studies in which people have actually tested the cattle, and a veterinarian-run study tested the cattle in which they've shown that the cattle were not harmed. This is anecdotal, and given that we're dealing with people's livelihoods, the livestock, maybe I shouldn't be so glib, except I've worked with so many ranchers and on so many ranches, and as Dee Dee pointed out west in her experience, and so many experiences Xerces Society employees where we have milkweeds and livestock together, and there's no complaint from any of the ranchers I deal with over many years with thousands of cattle involved, of no complaints of any losses in the presence of these milkweeds. So, and interestingly, if you had asked, well, what about studies that show that the milkweeds are killing livestock? I can come up with those citations. They're from over 100 years ago. They're from the days where ranchers out west used to dump 1,000 sheep on a few acres because they were desperate. And at that point, there was nothing for the sheep to eat except a few highly toxic milkweeds. They ate everything else. But yes, we do need peer-reviewed studies of this topic. But the anecdotal information is about livestock doing fine in the presence of milkweeds, poisonous or not. The anecdotal information is so strong that many of us think it's worth it to let people know that the cattle and milkweeds can coexist. You don't have to kill milkweeds.
Thank you so much, Ray. So Ray Powers, your question. This person's interested in the advantages of grazing bison versus cattle for pollinator habitat.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Lori. And I think Ray Moran's might chime in at the end here too. My current understanding of the research on that is that their diets are relatively comparable when they're grazed in a comparative manner as far as stocking rate. So some older citations will say that cattle eat more wildflowers than bison, and bison really focus on grasses. But we're finding that it's relatively similar. The one area that I think might differ is the wallows. So I think bison have a little bit different wallowing behavior than cattle. So that can kind of change across the landscape of where we're seeing disturbance on rangelands. But as far as I know, those are sort of the main differences. And Ray, what do you think?
and I want to chime in to say that from the citations I can remember, you're exactly right. I could swear there's some citations that came out even more recently that showed, you know what, when bison are grazed the same way as cattle, they are a little bit different in what they eat. But I cannot name you that paper. I think perhaps a paper or two by Brady Allred, but I need to search that. But yes, it could very well be that they're extremely similar in what they graze and what they do not when they are stocked in a similar way.
All right, thank you both. Ray Powers, another question from Lori. Can I get some resource suggestions for communities that I see spraying thistle during times when the bees and butterflies are active on them?
Yeah, so we have a couple of documents that I think could be useful, and they're a little dependent on where you are. So there's a lovely document out on the native thistles of Iowa. So if you're really anywhere in the central Great Plains region, that will cover many of the species that you might be seeing in your state. And you can just use that to advocate for the value of some of our native thistles. We also have a document on thistles. Is it thistle production? I can't remember if it's for native seed growers or if it's just highlighting the different species of native thistles in the center region of the country. So that should be really applicable for the Great Plains. I think it is just highlighting species, and Ray's given me a yes. So that's another one that's available on our website for a download, and it will give you kind of intense descriptions of each of those native thistle species. So you might be able to use those to sort of here on and show the value of keeping those native thistles. And if you just go to our website and then use the search box and type in thistles, that should come up for you. Those would be my resources. I don't know if anyone else on staff has anything else they'd like to add.
Ray, I just typed in the URL for the thistle guide into the chat box. So if you want to learn more about native thistles, and we hope you do, go to the chat box, please. We have many native species, and they're pretty much all awesome for pollinators. And it's a shame to be killing them because they tend not to be invasive. It's the exotic ones that tend to be invasive.
And if you're in California, I would recommend just looking up thistles on CalFlora. It's a really good website for any native plant and even non-native plant information. So if you are here in California, definitely look up thistles or the genus Xerces on CalFlora. And iNaturalist is also a really good way to learn about thistles or other plants and animals. So if any of you are into using apps on your cell phone, it's a great way to observe nature and learn about it. So you can definitely get some good pictures and figure out what you're looking at if you happen to find any out on your rangelands.
Thank you, everyone. Sarah, did you have something to add to that specific question, or are you ready for the next one?
I guess I would just like to chime in and say, to echo what everyone said, that our native thistles are great for our pollinators, but to kind of flip it and look at it from the manager's perspective, be it public land manager or private land manager, it's just nice to have one less thing that you need to spray. You know, you can save money on it, you can save your time and energy, because everybody has a lot of things that they're trying to do managing these huge acres of rangelands. So I would just think, you know, it's kind of maybe a relief to hear that those native thistles don't need to be sprayed out. So just to also advocate for from the human dimension side of things, it makes things a little bit easier on managers as well. But yeah, that would be all I'd have to say. And then we can go to the next question, Rachel.
Always good to hear that less work is better. So Lori also asked if neonicotinoids are being used on rangelands.
It's a good question, Lori, and I am not a pesticide specialist, but I have done a little bit of work and am looking to expand my knowledge on this topic, specifically the grasshopper management on native rangelands. I'm learning about that. The short answer is, to my knowledge right now, I don't think that the pesticides that are being used to manage grasshoppers are in the neonic category. But I continue to learn that there's a lot of treatments happening, chemical treatments happening on rangelands that I'm just naive to. So that's the best answer I can give you right now. But certainly we are using some, as Ray and Dee Dee talked about, we are using some insecticides on rangelands, but not neonics to my knowledge. And if I could just quickly insert to add to what Ray and Dee Dee mentioned about spraying insecticides on rangelands, they mentioned that this impacts a lot of non-target species. Our pollinators are certainly one of them, but to think about it, to kind of put on the ranchers' thinking cap, our dung beetles are also really important beneficial insects that all of the ranchers that I get the great honor of working with, they want to talk dung beetles as soon as we step into their rangeland. And that's an animal, you know, an invertebrate that I would encourage folks to think about too. And I don't want to take away from the loss that we have had, because I'm located in North Dakota and I cover eastern Montana, and in this region of the country we got hit pretty darn hard in western North Dakota, a little bit in western North Dakota, but especially eastern Montana this past year with grasshoppers. And I don't want to take away from that impact, as I can only imagine as a rancher, if you're looking at your forage that already might be not ideal for your cattle, and then you see these grasshoppers move through your land and decimate the forage you were really hoping would go to your cattle. That's huge, and that's I can't imagine what those ranchers are feeling. So I don't want to take away from the fact that, like, oh my gosh, this feeling of we have to do something, I have to spray somehow for these grasshoppers. I really sympathize with them, but I think we're just kind of campaigning for the idea of, let's be thoughtful about how we apply that chemical. Let's recognize that in treating those grasshoppers, we're also unfortunately hitting some non-target species that really do a lot of great work for us, and those dung beetles being one of them.
And I'll just chime in the chat. Sharon Salvaggio, who is on our pesticides team, has chimed in and verified, Sarah, that she also doesn't or isn't aware of any neonics being used on public rangelands. So thank you, Sharon. She's wonderful.
Yes, I didn't know you were on, Sharon. Thank you so much. I appreciate your expertise. Thank you.
Yeah, she's got her back.
Yeah.
We have such a good team here. It's wonderful. So one question that came up in the chat that I think is kind of in line with what we were just talking about with grasshoppers that Ray did answer, but I think we should answer live is there a source for grasshopper species economic thresholds?
Yeah. So the way I answered Kevin was that, I'm not aware of a great resource at this time. And then I actually texted Sharon and she emailed me, and my understanding was that the density numbers that APHIS uses to predict whether there will be outbreaks was maybe not super accurate, but she did say they have some economic threshold models at APHIS that take into account a variety of different parameters. So there might actually be some resources on APHIS that would help you define that economic threshold. And I do want to shout out that at Xerces as a team, we do have kind of a Bmps doc for that grasshopper and Mormon cricket control in the works, in the early stages, and it's something that we're thinking about. So we'll definitely have further guidance on that coming.
Yes, and thanks for saying that, Ray. I would like to chime in here too that as Ray Powers mentioned in her presentation, preventative measures is huge, and that from the little bit that I've learned, and I look forward to learning more, I think some of the nice news on this front as far as how to preventatively measure your rangelands against grasshoppers is to do typical best management practices for grazing, and that goes a long way towards buffering yourself and buffering the forage amount that you have available out there towards those grasshopper outbreaks. So it's a win-win. If you're doing the management that a lot of folks are already aware of, you're managing your rangelands well, then it at least will hopefully lessen the impacts when those grasshopper outbreaks do happen.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. And thank you so much to all of our panelists and all the work that you put into this presentation. Thank you all again, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.